So usually when we talk about a massive structure collapsing, right, say a skyscraper or a suspension bridge, there is this comforting expectation of structural clarity.
Oh, absolutely. It's a matter of engineering.
Right, exactly. Like a load-bearing wall gives out, and then the forensic architect opens up the structural report, spots a massive mathematical miscalculation in the schematic, points to it, and says, that's why it fell. The stress exceeded the capacity.
Because it's binary. I mean, it's just physics. We really like catastrophic failures to be visible, to have a very specific, undeniable origin point.
Yeah.
It gives us this illusion of control.
It really does. But the thing is, when the structure of a society gives way, suddenly that clarity completely vanishes.
Completely.
And everyone in the boardroom or the halls of power is just like an innocent bystander. And that exact vanishing act of accountability is what we are tearing apart today.
It's going to be a heavy one.
Yeah, we are taking a highly sophisticated, high-energy sociological deep dive into the anatomy of civilizational collapse. And we're using an ancient text that honestly reads less like theology and entirely like a masterclass in systems engineering.
Which I should say is precisely the lens required here.
Yeah.
If you approach this material looking for, religious sentimentality, you completely miss the architecture.
Right, you missed the math of it. So let me pose the sharp modern question that drives this entire analysis. When a failed state collapses, when the load-bearing social architecture of a civilization finally violently gives way, who takes the blame?
Historically speaking,
Yeah.
the blame is basically dispersed into the ether.
Yeah, there is a completely predictable political evasion playbook. I mean, we saw it in the 2008 financial crisis. We see it in the collapse of modern states, corporate bankruptcies, you name it.
Oh, it's everywhere.
The central bank blames the government for fiscal mismanagement. The government blames foreign interference or like global supply chain volatility.
Right.
The military blames the politicians for tying their operational hands. And then the clerical establishment or the moral authorities, they blame the ethical decay of the general public.
Always the public.
Always. Every single institution that formed a massive load-bearing pillar of this extractive architecture suddenly presents itself as a shocked observer to the collapse it actively engineered.
It is the ultimate systemic vanishing act. I mean, it really is. And what is profoundly fascinating is that the source material we are examining today stages this exact moment of systemic reckoning.
Right.
We are looking at verses 17 and 18 of a classical Quranic chapter known as Al-Furqan.
Mm.
But we were examining them specifically through the lens of Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
And for those listening who aren't familiar, we need to establish who Parwez is. He was a highly disruptive mid-20th century rationalist thinker.
That's who disrupted.
Yeah, he looked at these classical Arabic texts, completely stripped them of centuries of traditional orthodox, mystical baggage, and he analyzed them as pure social science.
Yes, and Parwez reads this specific passage in Al-Furqan as a literal sociological tribunal. It describes a scene, a day of gathering, where the system has failed, people are completely shattered, and the highest authority demands to know exactly how the collapse happened.
The scene basically puts the community's idols on trial. Now, Parwez makes a critical distinction here, right?
He does.
He argues we aren't talking about stone statues or wooden deities.
Not at all.
Sociologically, these idols, the aliha, are the unquestioned institutional authorities, the political, financial, and clerical elites to whom the community granted supreme power.
Right, the ones holding the levers.
Exactly. And at this tribunal, the ultimate question is posed to these institutions, which is, did you mislead these servants?
It is the most vital cross-examination in political history. Yeah. The highest authority is essentially asking, do you deliberately engineer this civilizational failure just to maintain your own power?
And the response from the institutions is what I can only describe as the most perfectly crafted corporate non-apology ever recorded.
It's brilliant.
They reply, Subhanaka makana yan bagilana natakiha min dunika min aluya, which translates roughly to, far be it from us, it was not for us to take allies apart from you.
The phrasing is just, it's brilliant in its absolute evasion. They are claiming, on the record, we never asked for the supreme unquestionable authority we wielded over these people.
It's wild. And then they pivot. They deliver their final brutal diagnosis of the public. They literally point at the masses and say, Bal Kanu Kanmanbora, meaning they were a people who were ruined, or more accurately, sterile.
They deflect the culpability entirely onto the populace.
It is exactly like a corporate board of directors showing up at a massive bankruptcy hearing. Like, the company is completely shattered, the employees' pensions are evaporated, the shareholders are ruined.
Right.
And the board points at the shattered employees and says, look, we didn't explicitly force them to invest their life savings in us. They just lacked financial literacy.
They made a bad choice.
Yeah. They were sterile investors. It's tragedy, really, but our hands are clean. So the mission of our deep dive today is to explore exactly how social systems trick communities into engineering their own sterility.
Yes.
How do institutions build a cage so perfectly that the people inside forget how to open the door, allowing the cage builders to say, hey, they locked themselves in?
To understand the mechanics of how a civilization dies from the inside out, we really have to begin with a deep linguistic analysis of that exact word the evasive institutions use to describe the collapsed community, the word bura.
Right, because usually in a standard textbook, you see Kalman Bura lazily translated as a people who were ruined or lost.
Which is so passive.
Exactly. But our sources insist that this passive translation completely obscures the underlying systemic failure.
It really does. If we look at the classical Arabic root, BWR, it carries a very precise operational meaning. It signifies sterility.
Okay, sterility in what sense?
Historically, it is an agricultural and economic term. It describes land that is bare, land that has been relentlessly overfarmed, extracted from, and mismanaged to the point where its biological capability to produce crops is just completely dead.
Wow.
Or, alternatively, it describes a market or a trade route that is entirely stagnant and can no longer generate returns.
So we aren't talking about a society that was conquered by a foreign military. This isn't a community where an invading force came in and salted the earth or bombed the infrastructure.
Not at all. It is a state of severe internal structural rot.
Yeah.
A common borough is a community that has entirely lost its biological, intellectual, and organizational capacity to generate productive outcomes.
It's an internal failure.
Exactly. It is a society where the generative momentum has ground to a halt from the inside.
That makes the institution's defense so much more insidious. If they are calling the public borough sterile, non-generative, what exactly did the public lose that induced this sterility?
Well, according to Parwez's reading, this systemic sterility is directly connected to the atrophy of a cognitive tool, a tool called the Furqan.
Let's define that clearly for everyone listening.
In this rationalist systems theory framework, the Furqan is the metric of critical discrimination. It is the intellectual ability of a populace to look at a system, an institution, a policy, or a leader, and objectively determine, does this structure generate capacity for human thriving, or does it extract and deplete it?
It is the ultimate societal feedback loop.
Right.
It's the critical thinking required to differentiate between a productive symbiotic structure and a parasitic one.
Exactly. And what this text suggests is that a Kwaman Bura is a society where that critical discrimination tool has physically and culturally atrophied.
Like a muscle that hasn't been used.
Precisely. The community can no longer tell the difference between a system that works for them and a system that is actively cannibalizing them.
Which I think reframes our entire understanding of the idols. Once we establish that the Furqan is a tool of socioeconomic discrimination, an idol is no longer a carved piece of stone.
No, the material of the idol is completely irrelevant.
Right. What makes an idol is its function. It demands blind, unquestioning obedience. It demands that you permanently turn off your Furqan.
Yes. So an idol is any entity, a political party, a central bank, a tech monopoly, a clerical council that says, trust us implicitly. Do not audit our ledgers.
Don't look behind the curtain.
Exactly. Do not apply critical thought to our edicts or algorithms. Outsource your reasoning to us.
The very act of idolatry, sociologically speaking, is the systemic surrender of critical thought.
It is.
Wait, I have to push back on the institution's defense then. At the day of gathering, the elites stand up and essentially say, we didn't explicitly tell them to stop thinking. We didn't mandate stupidity. Their dysfunction, their sterility was their own choice.
Right.
And technically, aren't they right? If the people chose to follow blindly, don't they bear the primary blame?
As a systems analyst, you have to look at their defense and recognize the horrific genius of it. Yes, technically, the populace made choices. But it is gaslighting on a civilizational scale.
How so?
Because it ignores the environment in which those choices were made. These institutions spent generations systematically suppressing the Furqan.
But how exactly? Because suppression implies active, forceful coercion, like secret police and book burnings.
It's often much more subtle than brute force. They build educational systems that reward rote memorization over analytical questioning.
Oh, wow.
Right? They construct economic structures that leave the working class too exhausted to engage in civic critique. They utilize media and clerical authority to brand anyone who challenges the systemic status quo as a traitor, an apostate, or a threat to social order.
So they rigged the game.
They architect an entire environment designed to atrophy the public's critical capacity over decades. And yet, at the precise moment the architecture collapses under the weight of its own extraction, they hold their hands up and say, they were a sterile people. We were just providing the leadership they asked for.
We just happened to be the ones hoarding all the wealth and power while they magically forgot how to think. It's an infuriating paradox.
It really is.
But that paradox forces us into the next logical corner. Because if the community possesses this inherent cognitive tool, this Furqan, why do they voluntarily surrender it in the first place?
That is the core question.
Right, because no human being wakes up and consciously says, I would love to be intellectually sterile and economically extracted from today. So how does the system actually engineer that surrender?
That drives us straight into the psychology of institutional design, specifically the problem of distributed accountability.
Let's lay out the mechanics of distributed accountability, because this is where the theory hits reality. This is a system designed so that the authority is highly concentrated within a tiny elite, right?
Yes.
The boardroom, the executive branch, the high council. But the outcomes of their decisions, meaning the poverty, the societal rot, the ecological collapse, those are diffused across millions of people at the bottom.
And because the negative outcomes are diffused horizontally across the masses and delayed chronologically over time, the institution can endlessly maintain plausible deniability.
They never feel the pain of their own choices.
Exactly. They can constantly claim that the gap between their immense concentrated power and the community's immense diffused misery is just, well, an unfortunate byproduct of complex variables they couldn't control.
But the people still have to buy into it. The masses have to accept the premise that these elites should hold that power.
Right.
And this is where the source material brings in an incredible reference to Erich Fromm, the mid-20th century psychoanalyst. I have to admit, seeing Fromm referenced in a deep dive on classical Arabic linguistics was unexpected.
It is a surprising crossover.
But his theory perfectly explains the psychological mechanism of this surrender.
Fromm was writing in the aftermath of World War II, trying to understand how massive populations voluntarily submitted to totalitarianism, and the force points directly to a seminal concept, the fear of freedom.
Which is such a counterintuitive phrase.
It is. Fromm argued that while humans romantically claim to desire freedom, we are actually deeply terrified of its operational reality.
Because true freedom is an agonizing cognitive burden.
Yes.
If you have to actively apply the Furqan, if you have to critically evaluate every political policy, fact-check every news source, audit every economic system, and question every moral edict before you accept it, I mean, that is a massive, exhausting cognitive load.
It's overwhelming.
You are solely responsible for your choices. If you make the wrong call, it is entirely on you.
Exactly. The psychological weight of constant critical discrimination is immense. And to avoid that heavy burden, the masses actively seek out what Fromm called ready-made decisions.
Ready-made decisions.
Yes, they desperately want to outsource the cognitive load. They look to institutional authorities to say, here is the undeniable truth, here's the correct path, just follow this, and you will be safe from the anxiety of choosing.
If I look at my own life, I see this microscale surrender constantly. Every time I click accept all cookies on a website just so I can read an article, without spending 20 minutes analyzing the data privacy policies, I am trading my Furqan for comfort.
That is a brilliant example.
I am outsourcing my critical discrimination to the corporation because the cognitive load of evaluating it is too high.
That is a perfect modern parallel. The institution says, give us your authority, and we will give you certainty and convenience. And the people make the trade.
But the danger isn't just in that single transaction, right? The source material emphasizes that this atrophy is gradual and self-reinforcing. It's the generational compounding of of sterility. Can we walk through the math of how a society permanently loses this capability?
Yes. Let's look at the timeline. When one generation accepts an institution's ready-made decision without running the Furqan test, without asking, does this generate capacity or extract it? They begin to lose the habit of critical thought.
Right.
It's a neurological and sociological muscle.
Yeah.
If it isn't exercised, it begins to degrade.
It's exactly like a society that relies entirely on GPS navigation. Let's trace that out. The first generation that adopts GPS still fundamentally knows how to read a map,
Sure.
They have an internal sense of true north. They recognize topographical landmarks. They just use the GPS for convenience to avoid the cognitive load of navigating.
But they teach their children to only use the GPS.
Yes. That second generation never even learns the concept of map reading. And by the third generation, the biological capability in the human brain's hippocampus to build spatial maps has physically atrophied.
Which means the systemic dependence is now absolute.
Right. Because each generation that accepts the external authority without testing it produces a subsequent generation that fundamentally cannot test it, even if they suddenly realize they were driving toward a cliff.
Yes.
If the GPS satellite goes down for the third generation, they are completely paralyzed. They are bra. They are biologically sterile in their capacity to navigate reality.
And in the socio-political context, when the crisis finally hits, when the economy crashes or the supply chain breaks, that third or fourth generation looks at the very institutions that caused the crash and pleads, "Save us. Tell us what to do."
Wow.
The society is incapable of generating a new, better system because the cognitive tool, the Furqan, has been entirely bred out of them.
Okay, I understand why the people surrender the tool out of psychological exhaustion, but let's look at the other side of the equation.
Okay.
How exactly do these institutions maintain this highly concentrated power over multiple generations without facing a massive revolt? Because surely, eventually, the reality of hunger or systemic oppression would act as a shock to the system and wake people up, right? You can only starve someone so long before they fight back.
You would hypothesize that. But the source material outlines two massive complementary sociological mechanisms, tools of extractive architecture that institutions utilize to keep the community trapped in that sterile state.
Okay, what are they?
The first is an economic mechanism, which the source explicitly identifies as capitalistic extraction.
Let me interject here with an important disclaimer for you, the listener. It's crucial to note that Parwez and Allama Iqbal, who we will discuss shortly, are analyzing these mechanisms through a specific mid-20th century socioeconomic lens.
Yes, that context is important.
Our goal in this deep dive is not to endorse a specific political ideology or to take a partisan stance against capitalism or religion. We are impartially analyzing how these thinkers diagnosed the systems of their era to explain systemic collapse. So, with that context out of the way, how does extreme wealth concentration physically destroy societal generation?
It operates by creating a closed loop of scarcity that dictates the biological bandwidth of the population.
Biological bandwidth.
Yes. When a social architecture is designed around the endless accumulation of capital by a fraction of the populace, the extraction at the bottom is so severe that the masses are constantly pushed to the absolute edge of biological and economic survival.
The source illustrates this using an incredibly visceral concept from Surah 16, verse 112. And again, a surah is simply a chapter in this foundational text. It describes a once prosperous society that failed to critically assess its structural systems, and as a natural result, it was enveloped in a garment of hunger and fear. Libas al-Juwakov.
And we must strictly analyze that garment not as divine retribution, but as a sociological algorithm.
Right.
Being wrapped in a garment of hunger and fear is the mathematical, inescapable socioeconomic result of unchecked extractive policies. It is an engineered state of perpetual precarity.
The mechanism is cognitive bandwidth. If you are wearing a garment of hunger and fear, if you are terrified about making rent, if you don't know how you are going to afford groceries next week, your brain is locked in pure survival mode.
Exactly.
Scarcity mindset literally drops your IQ in the moment. You lose your freedom to think because your entire biological processing power is consumed by the lack of freedom from want.
Precisely. You cannot critique the macroeconomic policies of the central bank or audit the structural integrity of the state when you are working 3-gig economy jobs just to survive the week.
You just don't have the energy.
The economic mechanism ensures the working class is too exhausted, too hungry, and too fearful to apply their Furqan.
But wait, that only solves half the problem for the institutions. That state of exhaustion, the garment of hunger, that only controls the physical body.
Right.
It explains why the desperately poor don't revolt. But it doesn't explain why the well-fed middle manager still bows to the system. What about the people who aren't starving? What about the educated classes who have enough leisure time to read, to organize, and to start questioning the architecture? There has to be a second mechanism targeting the mind.
And that is exactly where the source material introduces the intellectual mechanism.
Okay.
This is brilliantly articulated through the poetry of Allama Iqbal, specifically his famous poem, Iblis ki Majlisi Shura, which translates to Satan's Parliament, or Satan's Advisory Council.
This framing device absolutely floored me. Explain Iqbal's context quickly, and then let's break down this poem.
Iqbal was a philosopher, poet, and politician in British India, deeply concerned with why the Eastern world had fallen into such profound stagnation and colonization.
Right.
In this poem, he imagines a corporate boardroom meeting of the ultimate extractive system. Satan, representing the ultimate architect of systemic exploitation, is sitting with his advisors, reviewing their global strategy for maintaining highly concentrated power.
And they're discussing what poses the greatest existential threat to their empire. You would assume the Devil's Parliament would be terrified of violent political revolutions or mass uprisings or disruptive technology. But they dismiss all of that. What is their actual ultimate fear?
They do not fear political unrest because political unrest is just a reshuffling of the deck.
They just buy the new guys.
Exactly. They can always co-opt a new dictator or fund a new faction.
Oh.
What they are truly terrified of is the awakening of the rational, critical mind. They fear a community that regains its Furqan. So, to prevent this from happening among the classes that aren't starving, the advisors proudly present their greatest intellectual weapon, which is the engineering of extreme docility through mysticism, asceticism, and extreme monasticism.
They use anti-materialism as an institutional weapon. This is completely counterintuitive, but deviously effective.
It is genius.
The advisor in the poem basically reports, "We have successfully kept the East asleep by administering an opium of passivity." They teach the masses that poverty is actually a spiritual virtue.
Right.
They condition the public to view systemic suffering as a badge of holiness. They tell them to abandon the material world entirely, to submit endlessly to authority, and to focus exclusively on their reward in the afterlife.
It completely neutralizes any intellectual or organizational threat to the extractive institutions. If an elite class can convince a population that their suffering in this world is divinely ordained, that challenging authority is a spiritual sin, and that they should just patiently endure injustice while waiting for paradise, that population will never revolt. They will never demand an equitable distribution of resources. They will look at the corrupt politician or the hoarding monopolist and say, let them have this temporary corrupted world. My reward is in the next.
I need to synthesize this because this is a massive aha moment for me. If we map these two mechanisms together,
Go for it.
extreme materialism, the capitalistic extraction, starves the body's capacity to revolt. People are too physically exhausted and precariously positioned to fight back. Meanwhile, extreme anti-materialism, the institutionalized mysticism and monasticism, starves the mind's desire to revolt.
Right.
It makes them spiritually proud of their own subjugation. Starve the body, starve the mind. They are two sides of the exact same control mechanism.
I emphatically agree. They are perfectly complementary algorithms in the extractive architecture. One beats you down with material precarity, and the other anesthetizes you by telling you that being beaten down makes you holy.
It's a perfect trap.
Between the two, the Furqan doesn't stand a chance. The society becomes completely profoundly burra, sterile, incapable of changing its own parameters.
But I'm struggling with this. If this dual-engine system is so invincible, if the extractive architecture has both the economic hammer and the intellectual anesthetic working in perfect tandem, how does the collapse actually happen?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because the whole premise of verses 17 and 18 is that the building does fall down, the society does collapse, and they are standing in the ruins at this tribunal. What brings the system down?
This brings us to the most scientifically rigorous mathematical concept in Parwez's analysis. Mukafat-e-amal, or the law of requital.
Define that strictly in systems theory terms, stripping away any theological overtones. How does a system mathematically punish itself?
In pure systems theory, the law of requital is the natural, inescapable operation of a system running against its own physical or organizational parameters. It is cause and effect operating on a civilizational scale.
Okay, break that down.
Actions have built-in, unalterable consequences. If you build a bridge using inferior, brittle steel to save money, gravity doesn't punish the bridge out of a sense of moral outrage. Gravity simply operates, and the bridge eventually collapses because the materials violated the mathematical parameters of load-bearing.
The universe is just an ultimate ledger, and the ledger always balances.
Exactly. And in this sociological framework, the law of requital operates simultaneously on two distinct levels. Level 1 is the community's consequence. Level 2 is the institution's consequence.
Except in level 1 first, the community's consequence. They made a choice, as we established. They chose to fear the burden of freedom. They chose to grant supreme authority to unaccountable institutions. They traded their Furqan for the comfort of ready-made decisions.
Yes. And the consequence of that action was not a sudden lightning bolt of destruction from the sky. The consequence accumulated slowly over generations, exactly like the GPS analogy.
The atrophy.
The mathematical consequence of surrendering critical thought is that society became biologically, intellectually, and structurally sterile.
Yeah.
They lost the ability to innovate, to correct course, to survive environmental or economic stress. Their civilizational collapse is the delayed but inevitable biological result of their own intellectual atrophy.
Then there's level 2, the institution's consequence. The elites who thought they had completely hacked the system, they built these massive architectures of social control. They used the economic hammer and the intellectual opium. They actively suppressed reason, silenced the discriminators, and intentionally engineered the community's sterility so they could hoard power indefinitely.
And their consequence manifests as the total structural collapse of the architecture they are now testifying at. By making the public sterile, they slowly destroy the generative engine that produced the wealth and stability they were extracting from.
Oh, I see.
If a parasite completely incapacitates its host's ability to forage for food, the parasite eventually dies of starvation itself. The system cannibalized its own foundation.
The host dies, the parasite dies. But the source material highlights this absolutely fascinating, highly contentious dynamic at the moment of collapse.
Yes, the double punishment.
There is this scene where the followers, the masses, are standing in the ruins of the society looking at their leaders, and the masses demand that the leaders receive double punishment. They essentially say, they misled us, we were starving and brainwashed, make them suffer twice as much. And what is the text's verdict?
The verdict is the brutal mathematical fairness of the system. The text responds that both receive double punishment. Not just the leaders. The followers receive double consequence as well.
Wait, I have to stop you there. I heavily push back on this. You're saying the masses get double punishment because they empowered the leaders. But 20 minutes ago, we established that they were trapped in a garment of hunger and fear and functionally brainwashed by institutionalized mysticism.
They were.
How can a system mathematically punish someone for a choice they were literally too starved and exhausted to make? That feels inherently contradictory and incredibly harsh on the victims.
It is harsh, but it is structurally consistent. You have to look at the cumulative timeline, not just the final generation. The law of requital accounts for the entire causal chain.
Okay, walk me through it.
The leaders receive double consequence. First, for their own crimes of active extraction and corruption, and second, for deliberately misleading the masses and suppressing the Furqan.
Okay, the leader's double consequence is obvious. Explain the masses.
The masses receive double consequence. First, for their own systemic crimes, their own failure to uphold justice at the micro level, their own petty extractions, their willingness to participate in the corrupt system as long as they got a small piece of it.
Right.
But the second consequence is for the foundational crime of empowering the leaders. By surrendering their Furqan initially, by giving the idols supreme authority to avoid the burden of freedom, they provided the structural fuel that allowed the extractive machine to run.
So the system views complicity as a primary mechanism of failure.
Precisely. The extractive leaders could not have maintained their oppression if the masses had not collectively consented to be docile. The architecture requires the consent of the governed, even if that consent is coerced over time.
This removes the entire concept of the noble victim from the equation of civilizational collapse. If you surrender your critical thinking, you are actively complicit in the collapse of your own civilization.
Yes.
You do not get a systemic pass just because you weren't the CEO or the prime minister or the high cleric. By choosing not to look at the map, by clicking accept all cookies on your civilizational operating system, you helped drive the car off the cliff.
It is an incredibly sobering, unforgiving framework. And it brings us full circle back to that initial testimony at the tribunal. When the institutions look at the ruins and cry out Subhanaka, far be it from you, it is a moment of terrifying, profound realization.
Right, because usually we hear Subhanaka as a phrase of religious praise or glorification. But here, Parwez interprets it as a realization of absolute, unyielding cosmic order.
Yes. At the exact moment of collapse, the institutions look at the ruins of their empire, and they suddenly realize that the rational, generative order of the universe, the very parameters of cause and effect they spent centuries denying, suppressing, and trying to cheat, is the inescapable standard against which their entire failure is being measured.
They hit the wall.
They thought they could extract infinitely without consequence. Subhanaka is their horrified realization that the universe's ledger always inevitably balances.
We thought we hacked the code, but the code was unbreakable.
Yeah.
Chilling. So how do we synthesize this? Because as much as we have been analyzing classical Arabic roots and mid-century sociologists, this is a depressingly modern pattern. We can observe the exact dynamic of verses 17 and 18 playing out in real time right now across the globe.
It is ubiquitous. In every sector of modern life, in any society, any multinational corporation, any political state where institutional accountability is systematically replaced by institutional self-preservation, the ultimate moment of reckoning always mirrors this exact scene.
The unquestioned authority will always claim that the community acted autonomously. Think about it. When a toxic social media platform is called in front of a congressional committee to testify about the massive political polarization and mental health crisis its algorithms caused, what does the CEO say?
We just built a neutral platform.
Exactly. The users chose to click on the inflammatory content. They chose to be polarized. We didn't force them. When aggressive deregulation causes a catastrophic financial meltdown, what do the bankers say? We just offered the financial products. The public chose to take on subprime debt they couldn't afford.
Yep.
It is the exact same evasion playbook. We didn't force them. They were Abura people.
But Parwez's ultimate counter-argument is embedded in the very structure of the text we've been analyzing. The causal chain cannot be severed that easily by a corporate non-apology.
How so? Where is the proof in the text?
The very fact that the highest authority asked this question in the first place. Antum adlaltum ibadi hawlayam hum dalu Sabeel. Did you mislead these servants, or did they lose the way themselves?
Oh, wow.
That proves that the institutions are not off the hook. If the public was solely and autonomously to blame, the question wouldn't need to be asked. The Burr estate, that societal sterility, did not emerge spontaneously in a vacuum. It was systematically, meticulously produced over generations.
They built the cage.
The institutions designed and built the cage, even if the people eventually forgot how to fly.
Which brings us to the ultimate design problem. If we apply the Furqan to the text itself, what is the core question Al-Furqan is trying to solve for us? What is the goal of diagnosing this collapse?
The goal is to uncover the holy grail of systems engineering. What social architecture, what exact arrangement of political power, economic distribution, and educational philosophy produces a community that retains its capacity for productive discrimination, even under immense pressure from vested interests.
How do you build a society that fundamentally refuses to surrender its Furqan?
That is the design problem.
And that is the question that connects this entire journey directly back to you, the listener. Because whether you realize it or not, you are currently operating inside an architecture. You are inside a system that has economic mechanisms of precarity and intellectual mechanisms of docility working on you right now, trying to convince you to outsource your thinking.
The immediate practical question is, are you actively applying your Furqan? Are you critically evaluating the systems, the platforms, and the leaders that demand your compliance?
Or have you outsourced your critical thinking to an idol, a political party, a tech algorithm, a financial guru, a media echo chamber, simply because the burden of freedom and the cognitive load of discrimination is too heavy?
It is so much easier to just blindly follow the GPS until you drive into a lake.
But we know exactly how that ends. The stress exceeds the capacity, the building falls, the architecture collapses, and when it does, the idols you trusted with your autonomy will stand in the wreckage, look at you and say, we didn't force them, they just lacked the capacity, they were sterile.
It is a stark, mathematically precise warning. The law of requital is operating in the background of your life right now.
So I want to leave you with a lingering, highly intellectual challenge, something to mull over as you navigate your own systems, workplaces, and communities tomorrow. We have established today that every generation that accepts authority without testing it creates a more sterile generation. The habit of critical thought atrophies if you don't use it.
It does.
If that is true, what is the single most disruptive generative question you can ask the institutions in your own life tomorrow to test their fertility?
That's a great question.
Think about that load-bearing wall we started with at the beginning of the deep dive. The forensic architect pointing at the blueprints. You don't have to wait for the building to collapse to check the math. Where is the stress in your system? Who is diffusing the negative outcomes while aggressively hoarding the authority? And most importantly, are you going to demand to see the blueprints? Or are you just going to sit there and hope the ceiling holds?